So tonight we have a very special set of guests for you, and I'm covering them up here. Brad Westfall,
Joe Fleming, and Kevin Lonnie.
Joe Fleming and Kevin Lonnie, who are here to talk to us about advanced JavaScript topics. As I understand, this is going to be a bit more of a discussion format. Each of these three gentlemen come extremely highly recommended, but of course, all of us here know our stuff, and so we invite conversation and whatnot. But I've known Brad the longest here, and super grateful that he was able to assemble this crew and come out and talk with us. So let's give a warm welcome to this crew.
We're really happy to be here. I didn't turn on the AC, and it did get a little bit cold, kind of like over here.
Yeah, we might be
a little cold. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
we're right underneath
Yeah.
it. It's all energized. Yeah, exactly. Keeps on our toes. Yeah, thanks for having us out. I know originally Dallin had talked to me about coming and talking about JavaScript, and we were talking about, well, what should we talk about? And I thought, why don't we just literally just talk about JavaScript and not necessarily have a certain library or a certain thing. And then as I started realizing that I don't know everything about JavaScript, I invited two of my friends who actually literally know everything about JavaScript. It's totally true. They know more than I do, that's for sure. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. The way I kind of see the format going is I was going to tell you a little bit of the backstory of JavaScript, kind of how it got started. And then I've got some bullet points up here. These are just my notes, so this wasn't really meant to be so much projected, but if you want to look at it, it's fine. But these are just some of the, this is kind of like the story, kind of like what happened first, what happened next. And then after this, I'll have to scroll down, but there's generic talking points. So we're going to get through this, and then we're going to mostly kind of go in whatever direction you guys want to go into if you have any specific questions. But while we're doing this, this is supposed to be a discussion, so ask us questions. These guys are going to field questions. I'm going to field questions. It's just kind of whoever feels most passionate about it. So that's how we're going to go. Sound good? Okay. Let's start with how many people. I'm not going to do very many surveys because they're never really accurate when you say how many people, right? But how many people are familiar with what ECMAScript is and why JavaScript is called ECMAScript? Okay, just a few. So we're going to talk about that. I really actually like studying the history of the web, reading all about how CSS and how JavaScript and how HTML got started, the whole Tim Berners-Lee story and everything. And I find it to be really fascinating. And actually, as I find these like really old articles, and actually W3C still has the very first website ever made. It's still online. You can still go see it. And look at the source and everything. So as I find some of these like relics of the past, I've been wanting to like archive them. So I made a GitHub repo called History of the Web, and I'm hoping that people do pull requests and we all work on it together. And it's very small right now. There's only about maybe 10 things to link to, but I think it'll be cool once we get that going. So anyways, I guess this story starts out back in the mid-90s, in 1995, when Netscape was the biggest browser on the internet, and Microsoft was kind of gunning to be the biggest browser on the internet. Netscape was definitely leading and pushing browsers forward, even beyond what the standards said should be there. So I know that Microsoft is kind of known for going out of standard, but really it was Netscape that was the first one to really go out of standard. In fact, they made the image tag when there was never supposed to be an image tag, so we're happy for that. But the W3C wasn't even really well formed until about 1995 anyway. So to say that they were really going out of standard is kind of a farce, because there really wasn't no well-established standard. But in 1995 was this really special year, because that's really when Internet Explorer 1 started to emerge, and Netscape was still young, but was kind of a spin-off from Mosaic, and basically they wanted a scripting language to be in the browser. So they contacted this clever developer named Brendan Knight, and they wanted him to make Scheme inside the browser. That's literally what they told him. We want you to make Scheme in the browser. Scheme was a programming language that is a functional programming language that doesn't resemble anything that you're probably used to writing. If you write anything that resembles like object-oriented, like PHP or Ruby on Rails or Python or any of these languages that come from C++, they don't look anything like Scheme. But Brendan Eich loved Scheme, and they convinced him to go to Netscape to basically write the equivalent of Scheme in the browser, and he was excited to do that. But it took him a while to convince him to come on, and by the time they did, another part of Netscape was already in talks with Sun Microsystems about bringing Java into the browser. And Java, that story kind of turns into what became applets, Java applets. And when he got there, they said, just kidding, we're not going to let you make Scheme in the browser. And so they actually didn't even let him work on the front end in the browser itself because they were doing some server-side tools. And I think Mark Andreessen, is that his name, right? Who ran Netscape? Yeah. He basically said, all right, well, maybe we do need like a scripting language and not just Java. Java was meant to be the professional programming language, and they literally wanted a scripting language that was for hobbyists. And the comparison is made over and over again as I read about this kind of stuff, that what Visual Basic was to C++, Visual Basic being the hobbyist language and C++ was the professional language, that was supposed to be the relationship between this language that they were going to make and Java. It was going to be the hobbyist language. And they had a hard time naming it, but they wanted to call it Mocha because Java is like coffee and Mocha is like coffee. And so JavaScript was always supposed to be the little brother of Java. That's how it was supposed to be. But they couldn't call it JavaScript because there was trademark issues. Sun owned the trade name for Java, and even though they were working with Sun to implement Java, Sun didn't let them call it JavaScript. So it was called Mocha, then it was called LiveScript, and they basically told him, you can implement some Scheme-like things, but it's got to look like JavaScript. And so this is really interesting because it's got to look like Java. So it's got to look like the languages that are more object-oriented, and yet it's supposed to semantically behave more like languages that aren't. And that's probably why people who go to JavaScript even today get confused by it, because it looks like you're going to understand it, and you're probably not if you're coming to it from a language like PHP or Java even. And actually even the Java crowd hates JavaScript because they think it looks like Java, and then they get in there and it's not at all. So basically, they made JavaScript, and they called it JavaScript for like a second. And the name got out, and once a hot name gets out like that, it was kind of a publicity stunt because they knew that they weren't supposed to call it JavaScript. But all the blogs were talking about it, and it's got that name Java, which is already like a buzzword back then. But then they knew they were going to get in trouble, so they basically moved it to be a standard, to be an open standard. Specifically, they wanted to compete with Microsoft, and Microsoft was going to make a competitive scripting language for the browser. And so they knew that they wanted it to be a standard so that way it would be bigger, so they took it to Europe, to the European Computing and Manufacturers Association, so that's ECMA, and they called it ECMAScript. So the term JavaScript has always been slang for the real name ECMAScript, and that's how it got started. That was an earful, right? Okay, so moving forward in time a little bit, Microsoft, obviously with operating systems and Internet Explorer being the default browser, they were able to overtake and overcome Netscape. And so Netscape died off in the late 90s, early 2000s, basically leaving JavaScript being maintained by the ECMAScript folks over in the standards body, but also, Brendan Eich was still involved. But really, Internet Explorer came along and just dominated the scene. But JavaScript got to 1993. That's why when you hear ES6 or ES5 or something like that, ES3 is basically JavaScript version 3, and that was in 1999. So then moving forward, between 2000 and 2007, there was a lot of arguing about what JavaScript should turn into. And actually, they were talking about bringing classes into JavaScript and some sort of module system and even static typing, which were definitely Java things and not a scripting language like JavaScript things. They were talking about bringing that in as early as 2000. And we just got those things like this last year. But they've been talking about them since 2000. And it was this basically 7-year saga where Microsoft was ruling the web, and so Brett and I started up Mozilla and got refired up with ECMAScript, and there was a lot of going back and forth, and it was actually a very public like blog kind of dispute between Microsoft heads and Brett and I. So so then around 2005. People started wanting to do cooler things in JavaScript besides a drop-down menu and form validation. You guys remember doing it? Was anyone developing websites in 2005? Right? That's the only thing we use JavaScript for.
HTML. Pop-ups.
And pop-ups. Yeah. Yeah. What were you guys doing in 2005 in web design?
Pretty much just the drop-down menu. So.
Yeah.
Just like simple form input validation stuff.
Yeah.
Like
and even then,
really
it wasn't simple. Right?
Yeah. Like when Ajax came around, I started just offloading all that to the server because that's where the logic lived anyway.
I built like a JavaScript calendar, like the fact, I guess, like in 2002 or something.
I built something that would shake the browser window. It would like move it up and down and back and forth.
Yeah. I remember trying to do DHTML. You guys remember that? That was when HTML had moving parts. Well, HTML's never had moving parts. But that was when you were supposed to take JavaScript and move HTML around, make HTML happen, appear that wasn't there before or whatever. And it was painful. I remember the first thing I ever tried to do took me about 2 days to figure it out. And looking back on it about 2 years later when I was doing jQuery, it would have taken about 20 minutes to do. So that was really how powerful jQuery was. So this next part of the story is what I'm going to coin this term is the DOM library wars. This is basically when Prototype came out and MooTools and Dojo. By the way, some of the creators of Dojo are actually in town here in Phoenix, and they still run Dojo and they consult on it and everything. And jQuery, and it was like the what's going to win kind of thing, and kind of like what we're having now with like, let's say, React and Angular and maybe Ember. Well, clearly we all know that jQuery kind of went out, and that lasted until people started trying to make single-page applications in the front end, and that was in the late 2000s. And it was very difficult with just jQuery. jQuery was never meant to be an application type of language. It was always meant to just simply interact with the DOM. It's like an API to the DOM. It makes the API for the DOM easier is what it does. And so this is what, this is basically where Backbone came in. Backbone was the first really big tool that, it was basically just a wrapper for jQuery. I think you called it that, or one of you. You called it that, right? Yeah, why don't you talk about your thoughts on Backbone's success and why it was successful? And
I think it was just successful because it was really the first library that brought like the MVC concept to the front end. So we did, like Brad said, basically everybody started from jQuery, right? We all started just doing simple DOM manipulation stuff, and that would get out of hand very quickly. There weren't a lot of like frameworks or anything to make this stuff easier. And Backbone was it was a little late when it caught on, but it kind of exploded. And there were libraries for like Dojo did some of that stuff ahead of time too, where you could kind of define your data structure on the front end, so you wouldn't have to like keep asking the server for stuff to try and keep the state of your site in sync, I guess. But Backbone was this tiny library that built on top of jQuery that kind of gave you your application structure. So now you had this concept of like, I'm doing routing using the URL, but I'm not actually talking to the server necessarily. I have this entry point, this controller part that is loading up models, that is populating my views, and that's actually what's doing the rendering. And it allowed you to kind of separate all these different concerns. Where before, like, you just had this like, I don't know, 2,000-3,000 line file, which is all this jQuery spaghetti code that nobody ever wanted to touch. Yeah, I don't know. Backbone gave you some structure, and it was tiny and pretty easy to use.
Don't you think that like making a Backbone model and making a Backbone view, like the instantiation process, kind of reminds you of PHP a little bit? Like, you know, equals new, blah, extends, blah.
A little, yeah. The syntax around it was very familiar for people that generally did a lot of backend I don't know, web development, I guess, for lack of a better.
Seems like they almost went out of their way to make it an easy step, right, for someone coming from PHP or Ruby or something.
Yeah.
So, all right. So then, let's let's see. All right. One really amazing thing that Backbone gave us was underscore. Underscore was like its little sidekick project. They could have taken all these cool functionality things. Like, all right, so I'm going to assume that you guys are mostly PHP developers since you all do WordPress. This is a WordPress group, right? PHP has a large wealth of built-in functions for arrays. It has all kinds of stuff for strings. JavaScript barely has anything. Did you guys notice that? Like PHP's docs, it's like 40 different functions you can do for arrays. It's like literally that big. And JavaScript has like maybe less than 10 things. So underscore was basically, we call it the utility belt for JavaScript. It was basically all these things that you can do with strings and arrays and functions and objects. It's just little one-off functions. So it's definitely not like a library, or it's not a framework. It's definitely a library of tools. And Backbone depended on that. And they were very smart to realize that this little utility belt, anyone could use underscore for anything. It's not just a Backbone thing. And so they made it a separate project. However, they did make the mistake of not making it progressive enough. And also, is it called Semver? Is that the versioning thing that we use now, right? Okay, that's what does Semver stand for?
Semantic version.
Yeah, so when you see versioning things that are like 1.1.2 and it's like always like the 3 numbers, that's like the Semver thing. Like all the Node and all the JavaScript stuff follows that pattern. And that's really important if you're using things like NPM to get stuff. And then there's other ways of version stuff, like Ubuntu versions based on a chronological, number. So like, 14 point, well, how does it do? 14.1 or 14.4, and the 14 is the year and the 4 is April. So they have a different way of versioning things. Well, underscore had an interesting way of versioning things that made it somewhat incompatible with what would eventually become NPM and all the Node stuff. And so someone basically forked it and called it Lodash. And you guys see how there's like a play on words there, like an underscore is a Lodash. You see that? Okay. So Lodash is basically a complete copy of what underscore is. And if you're using Backbone to this day, you could either be using underscore or Lodash, and they both work the same. It's just that Lodash has a bunch of extra stuff. Okay, so so that was also something that really came out of this time, because even though Backbone is becoming, I wouldn't say obsolete, but it's definitely not popular anymore. It created, what's that?
It's still hugely popular, but nobody's
for
starting
legacy.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, yeah, it's not popular for a lot of new development. People, if someone's using Backbone today, I think it's probably because they're stuck with it until they make something else.
Why?
Well, just like any framework, maybe paved the way for other frameworks, but like in PHP, frameworks, like early frameworks like CodeIgniter and Cake, while some people still use them, are kind of going on the wayside of other frameworks like Laravel and what are some other popular PHP frameworks that are coming out?
Look at me. Laravel is.
So what are you replacing Backbone with?
That's what we're going to get into. Backbone was the first one to really pave the way, and I'm still kind of telling the story. Once I get to about 2012 or so, I'm gonna let these guys talk a lot more, I promise, because I study this history, and so I kind of like got it all memorized. But these guys fill in the gaps for me because I don't, like I said, they're the experts. Great. So one of the really great things that Backbone provided for us is it paved the way for other front-end frameworks, but also it eventually led to Lodash. Has anyone used Lodash? Familiar with it? Okay. So I only saw 2 or 3 hands. So if you struggle or maybe don't like JavaScript because it just doesn't have enough built-in things and you're used to PHP that has all these things that are built in, try out Lodash. It's amazing. It's pretty much becoming the standard library for these utilities for most major front-end tools.
So the creator of Lodash tweeted today that there are, across all the different versions of Lodash, every 13 milliseconds it's downloaded on NPM.
So on NPM, wow, 13 milliseconds.
Pretty popular.
That's pretty popular. Okay.
Automated build systems.
Hey, don't say that. So this leads us to about 2008, when they are finally getting over that ECMAScript 4 saga, And they're been fighting for years about ECMAScript 4, and they basically decided we're going to scratch ECMAScript 4. Like, it's too aggressive in terms of what we're trying to pull off. And so ECMAScript 4, JavaScript 4 never became realized. Instead, they decided to add a few things that were needed for ECMAScript 3, and they called it 3.1. And then there's this thing called ECMAScript Harmony, but that's not so much of a version of JavaScript as it is basically, I think their efforts to say, all right, you guys wanted some stuff and you didn't want some stuff. These guys wanted some stuff and they didn't. Let's create some harmony and let's decide what's really important. And so you'll read about this thing called ECMAScript Harmony, but as far, am I wrong about this? There wasn't like a thing. It was more of like an attitude about it.
It's, as far as I can tell, it's like a nomenclature that's just been used to describe like newer features that maybe are not necessarily fully in the spec yet.
Okay.
That you may have access to already, but they're not finalized.
Okay. Okay, cool. So ECMAScript 5 finally came out in 2009, so it didn't take them long to get over the 3.1 thing. So they went from 3.1 to 5, and something else happened really interestingly in 2009, and that is, what was the guy's name who created Node? I think you guys probably know. I don't remember his name.
Ryan Dahl.
What's that?
Ryan Dahl.
That's right. So he was on a website, I think it was Flickr, and he was noticing that the progress bar, or the uploading files, didn't have a progress bar and didn't do a really good job of telling you like the progress of the upload. And I don't know why that gave him the idea to do Node, but that's what Wikipedia page said, so I'm gonna go with it. Okay. So basically, he decided to take the V8 engine. You guys all probably know what like the CSS rendering engines are, like the Gecko one for Firefox and Chrome's WebKit, right, for Chrome and all that kind of stuff. Those are the rendering engines, but there's also JavaScript engines that are inside of these things. And the V8 engine for Chrome, which was the fastest engine that was out, someone decided to basically make that headless, which basically means make it without a user interface or without the ability to display things like on a screen in terms of pixels or whatever, and basically port it to the server side. So that's what Node is. Node is Chrome's V8 engine ported to the server, and giving it some extra abilities like to do stuff with file systems like what you would normally expect, and not be able to do things like DOM manipulation because there's no DOM on the back end. Did I pretty much hack that up, or is that about right? See, that's what they're here for, green light. Okay, so that's basically has led us to where we are today, or actually 2015 was interesting because it was the year that people started talking about fatigue, library fatigue and JavaScript fatigue. Too many things coming out too fast. Angular came about, Ember came about, now we have React. So there's this conversation piece that's been going on for a little while. I'm gonna let you guys pick this up from here. But it's the monolithic idea. Should a framework be monolithic or should it be more a la carte? And I know you guys know what I'm talking about. So why don't you, Kevin, why don't you give us your take on just that conversation in general, and let them know what is monolithic and also what is more a la carte.
Well, I guess my own experience when I was a younger developer, I liked the idea of like the big monolithic framework that kind of, everything in the kitchen sink does everything you need it to do, right? But as I matured more, and like now today, I much more prefer doing the a la carte type of thing, like you're saying. Pick and choose the pieces that you need and leave out the rest. You have a much slimmer app that runs a lot faster. It doesn't have all this baggage that it's carrying around. So, with Angular, that's one of those monolithic frameworks. It's comes with pretty much everything in the kitchen sink, even if you're not necessarily going to use all of that. Ember is another one of those. But then there's a lot of other really small frameworks that do just like one specific thing, and they're really good at that one thing, and that's it. And React is one of those. React just happened to get like really, really popular, probably because Facebook made it, right? So it had a lot of exposure. But I mean, like jQuery is another example of that. It was something that was built to do like one specific thing. I mean, eventually they started tacking on more and more stuff to it, but it never grew to the point of being like the monolithic framework like Angular is. So I don't know, it's just my personal views on it. I prefer that, the a la carte approach. And I think a lot of that came from my experience learning Node. So like with Node in general, the way you end up building applications is you're kind of almost railroaded into that a la carte approach because you have to install different things with the npm and kind of just figure out which pieces you need. So what else?
I would think that CommonJS, and we can talk maybe about require versus CommonJS, right? But obviously Node chose CommonJS. It's really, I think that CommonJS happening on Node and inspiring how a bunch of code made by people who've never met each other should all work together, right? I think that maybe inspired, the front end world too, because now we can use all these front end tools, and that's why we can have a front end application that is a la carte tools that all work with each other, is because we have things like Webpack and Browserify. So do you want to elaborate on that anymore?
Yeah, so obviously before Node really got big on the scene, we had AMD, asynchronous module dependencies, definition. So what that did for us was allow us to, define different pieces of an application, and I think that was, still not really necessarily the most popular way to do it at the time, but really got popularized as Node was starting to get more popular. But then eventually, like Brad was saying, it led to people wanting to do that more the Node way of doing things, rather than having a giant like configuration trying to describe what all the parts of your application are. You just kind of create a variable that points to, well, this is that particular module. So you guys may know in like the CommonJS style, you have a special keyword called require, and you just type in the name of whatever that library is, Lodash or whatever. So you're able to just say var this equals require that. And so that whole idea, the simplicity of it, a lot of people wanted to use that on the front end as well, and that's where Browserify came from. So Browserify basically polyfilled that require keyword into the front end so that you could do it that way instead. And then AMD pretty much quickly died after that.
Because it's a much better way of doing it. Let's have you guys ask any questions, because we just said a lot of stuff. Do you guys want maybe another version of that, of a recap of what CommonJS is and what AMD is? Because I feel like that is a foundational knowledge for probably what's going to be the rest of the conversation, because everything kind of stems from that these days in JavaScript. Right?
A lot of it is sort of it's like some of it's moved because of ES6, right? Like,
well,
CommonJS
ES6,
sort of becomes ES6, so you can just get imports.
Sure, but ES6 decided to do imports and modules the way that they did, probably because of the success of it. So it's highly, highly influential. Yeah. So you guys are good there? You guys want us to talk about that anymore? Okay. Well, Joe, what do you want to talk about in that area? Anything?
I don't know, man.
Can you talk a little bit more about Browserify? I can't really wrap my head around that one.
So, like I was saying, Browserify really, I mean, to just put it into really simple terms, it's just a polyfill. I mean, you're familiar with that term,
Yeah.
right? So it just makes the require word available for the browser.
And, oh, go ahead, sorry.
So when you write your code for the front end, you're able to just say require such and such, Lodash or something like that. And what Browserify will do is require is just a function, like it's not a special keyword on the browser side. And that function will basically just point to where that module's code was kind of like loaded down at the bottom of your script somewhere. So Browserify, whatever required statements you have in there, first it'll scan through and find out, well, which libraries do they want in there, first of all, and it'll take the source of all those libraries and kind of like just stick them, at the bottom of your code, so that when it runs in the browser, it just has a pointer going to where that code is.
So its output's like an error if that library is not there.
Yeah, I mean, if you forget to npm install it or something like that, yeah.
Does Browserify add any other Node APIs to your
No.
Other than that, or is it just like for loading?
It's just for the common.js thing, I think.
Yeah.
So you know how in PHP, if you have a PHP file, and you do like include set of PHP files, they all share the same namespace. Like you made variables in one file, but you could basically read those variables in one of the other files, right? One of the cool things about common.js, breaking up your JavaScript files into multiple files and then kind of requiring them all into one file, is that each JavaScript file has its own namespace. That's one of the beauties of it. And when you bring them all into one file, that one file only sees whatever each file exposed to it and not the things it didn't want to expose to it. And so that's really nice for modularity. And we want that in the front end too, but the front end doesn't have anything like this. And so when you write require, the word require, and then run it through Browserify, Browserify rewrites the code to put it in basically its own little JavaScript modules in a way that is compatible with the front end, and then ships that to the browser. So it's not like the browser is ever aware of the word require. It just, all it sees is a bunch of JavaScript that's segmented, and you got to write it one way and then produce something else. It's very similar to like what Sass is for CSS.
Okay, so it's kind of like a post-processor.
Yeah, that's what that is. And then Webpack is basically the same thing, but it has a bunch of extra cool tools.
I would say Webpack is more, so like Browserify is, polyfilling the whole like require and exports keywords that are kind of built in with common.js on Node. But then Webpack is more like a full-on build tool. So
yeah,
like with Browserify, you don't really have the ability to kind of, there's ways to do it, but it's not built into Browserify. You don't have the ability to like minify the code or anything like that. You have to use other tools that are kind of just done in line with Browserify to do those kind of things. Whereas Webpack provides actual interfaces for those tools to be loaded as plugins. So it's like a more serious like build tool.
And since we're on that topic, unless you guys have any other questions, I wanted you to talk about build tools, but specifically, you were there at Node probably when Node AZ, another meetup group in the Valley, where Gulp was basically born. And so you could probably talk about the early conversations of that as well. So do you want to give us just a little, do you want to talk about grunts for a hot second and then talk about Gulp as well?
Sure. So I'm going to assume I'm going to see some hands here. Does anybody not know what like grunt and gulp and broccoli and all that stuff is? All right, a couple hands, awesome. So when you hear these terms, you may or may not have heard the terms depending on your ecosystem, whatever. They're basically just build tools. It's a way to really just automate things, right? So let's say CSS minification, for example. You don't really want to upload your raw CSS file. You want to like compress it, and, make it smaller, maybe take a bunch of CSS files, turn them into one file so that when you serve it up, it's just one URL request or whatever. There's a lot of WordPress plugins and stuff that do this as well. Those of us not using WordPress have to do this some other way, right? And grunt, gulp, insert name of build tool X allows you to automate this stuff. It gives you a lot of tools and modules and stuff to make that a little bit easier. Was there anything?
Well, so yeah, and I'll just say that Grunt was the first major one made in JavaScript. It ran in Node. They got really popular. But has everyone heard of Grunt? Probably. Who's actually written stuff in Grunt? About the same people. Okay, so Grunt, it's called Grunt because it does all the grunt work. Okay, in other words, when you write a Sass file, every single time you make an edit to your Sass file, do you want to go into command line or whatever your tool is, even if it's a tool you have built into your text editor, do you want to go and hit a button that says build this into a CSS file, or do you just want it to happen automatically, right? Okay, so there's Sass, and then there's about 15 other things that I want to happen automatically. Like some people don't even write JavaScript as much as they write CoffeeScript, which is a language that you write in when you, let's say, don't like the JavaScript syntax, but you want to write in CoffeeScript and have it compiled into JavaScript, only because you don't like the JavaScript syntax. And that's these hands, right? You guys like that. No, it's joking. But there's all these things that you don't want to always have to hit the big button to build it. You just want it to happen. So Grunt was the first one to do that for Node. And the way that you do grunt is you install it. It's very easy to install once you know how to install anything in npm. And basically, installing something in npm is as easy as npm install grunt. You just type those words out in terminal, you hit enter, and it just happens. Okay, if you're not on Windows. So
It's not true anymore.
yeah, you're right. It's not true. So the way that you would build your grunt file is basically a big configuration file. It's basically JSON, if you're familiar with JSON, or like kind of what object literals look like. I shouldn't say JSON because it's technically an object literal. They're kind of slightly different. But you basically do a configuration file. You say, grunt, here's the directory for my SAS files. Here's the directory for I want you to export them to, and that's it. It's a configuration file. Gulp is pure node. You write functions, you make variables, and it does the same thing. I'll let you take it from here, but that's one of the defining differences. When people say, what is the difference between Gulp and Grunt? That and streams, but the two biggest differences are, one of them is a configuration file, and the other one is more written like code.
Yeah. So they're both different tools that do the same thing, but they do what they do a little bit differently.
Like less than SAS.
Yeah. So Grunt, like Brad said, was generally very configuration driven. So you just have like a little JSON file that would say like, all right, I have these SAS files. I want to turn it into CSS files. So these SAS files live here, and there's some pattern matching to say like maybe multiple SAS files or whatever. And I want them to be compiled into, say, a single file, and I want it to be output here. So you'd have input, you'd have output, and then you'd say like this is going to be attached to the SAS module. From there, you probably want to minify that CSS. So you'd have another process that would say, all right, there's going to be CSS files here. I want you to minify them and then output that over here. It works, that idea works. Like I'm going to do all these things in little pieces, but it's kind of slow because you take your SAS, you run it to CSS, you save it to the disk. Then you take your CSS, you minify it, you save it back to the disk again. And that file I/O stuff is pretty slow. Gulp changes that using node streams. So effectively, you can say, all right, well, take these SAS files, run them through a transform, turn them into CSS, and take that existing transform without writing to the disk, just doing all this stuff in memory. Now minify this, and then take that and now write it to the disk. So you can write it as a single task, and it's just it reads really clean too, because it's just a chain of take CSS or take SAS, turn the CSS, minify, output.
So I actually took the time to pull it up here, although it's a little bit blurry. So this is a very simple grunt file that you can see here. The grunt file says grunt init config, and then you're passing in an object. And so the object is defined by all these curlies, and you're saying SAS. I want the distribution to be the files of main. It works from right to left. It goes, the main.scss gets turned into main.css. And if you wanted to have grunt do other stuff, you would just tack it onto the end of this list. It's basically just a big configuration file. Okay, so let's look at Gulp SAS. Here's the equivalent in Gulp. It's a function. Gulp is an object, and you say, so task is a method, so you say gulp.task, and you say I want to name this task SAS, and when the SAS task gets ran, call this function and source these SAS files, pipe them through the SAS engine, and then pipe them out to this destination. So we're talking about like real JavaScript code as opposed to a configuration. You guys see the difference a little bit, what I'm talking about? You have a question?
Are we going to evolve from that? Is it just going to get built into the JavaScript code and stuff instead of using Gulp and all this, like this from here and that from here to do the init or?
I don't really see that ever happening because I mean JavaScript is just a language. You know what I mean? Like think of like .NET and Visual Studio.
Visual Studio.
Right? Yeah. Like Visual Studio is not part of the language. Right? It's a tool for the language.
So we're always
the same way
gonna have
that Gulp and Grunt are tools for JavaScript.
Well, you don't actually have to use Gulp though.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, and that's a good point. And in PHP, when you really want to have really powerful stuff going on in PHP, you have to go and get C modules. You have to use, I think it's called like pickle like modules. Jeff, help me out. And then there's where's the other? It starts with a P, like the other library of functionality you can bring in. Yeah, so there's all these like C library. Like if you want to do image magic, right? Has anyone tried to implement image magic in PHP? How painful is that? It's extremely painful. Even today, it's very painful. But with Node, it's as easy as saying npm install whatever library you want, opening up a file, saying require this tool into my file, and just start using it. And the documentation is generally really good, and all the JavaScript is really easily compatible with each other. It's really nice to work in a modern day language that was just developed a couple years ago. I mean, PHP was made in 1995, and we're still dealing with some of the problems from then. Now, JavaScript was also invented, back then, but Node was just created only a couple of years ago, and it's a very modern workflow. It's really nice. So this is it. This is as good as it gets, but I love it. I mean, you might not like it, but I didn't like it at first when I wasn't used to it. It just takes, just like anything, it takes a little bit of getting.
Yeah, you just have to plug it in. Smart dude.
As opposed to me.
No, you're all smart if that's all you're out there. But
And then we'll go through your question, then Jeff has a question. But
okay, so mine's like a two question. Do you use JSON and Node together? And why we were saying Node versus
JS. Well, we're going to talk about io.js. That was actually on the notes.
But why would you would you use JSON and Node together, or just Node and just let it fly?
Are you asking about JSON, like JSON? Well, yeah, I mean that's with JavaScript, anything, Node or browser code, you can use JSON a lot.
So
you're integrating them all together.
Yeah. So something to think about with that question. That question, the reason why he has a hard time answering that is because you'll see that it almost doesn't make sense. Not to be offensive, but I'll show you why it doesn't make sense. If you're in Java, what is that? If you're in JavaScript, you can say person equals, and I just created an object, right? That's how simple it is to create an object. You can go straight to an object in JavaScript, as opposed to PHP. You make a class first, define all your rules in the class, and then you can make object instances out of the class, right? That's like traditional object-oriented programming. But this right here is an object. I can start adding, stuff to it like this, and that's a property. I can add a method to it, like say hi, and I can put a function over here. So we are making an object, right? Notice the way that it's done with the curlies, with the properties, and then the properties are basically a name, colon, the value, comma, this kind of thing. This looks strikingly similar to something called JSON, which looks like this. And I gotta put the quotes around here as well. This right here is more of JSON. JSON is more equivalent to XML. So JSON is not a language, just like XML is not a language. Like XML is more like a medium, right? Like this, like .NET application needs to send stuff over to this PHP application. The only common ground they have is some sort of serialized.
Spitting it out.
Yeah, so they both speak XML. That's what JSON is.
Okay.
JSON is basically something that very easily turns into JavaScript objects. In fact, JSON stands for
JavaScript object notation.
So that's what it is.
And what'll really blow your mind is, technically speaking, you can't even write JSON in a JavaScript file.
Yeah.
That looks like JSON, but that's still an object.
Yeah.
JSON is actually...
It has to be in a .json file.
Right,
and
then you could call on it.
So when Ajax calls the server can respond with plain text or XML or JSON. It's a medium used for so that's why I'm saying that is there going to be JSON in Node is a weird question, because there's never going to be JSON in any JavaScript. There's objects in JavaScript.
No, but are you guys like doing all of it together all the time is what I was trying to say. Like,
I think the answer to your question is yes.
Yeah, so whether you're in the front end or you're at Node, you're communicating data between one or the other or some other system. And the way to do that is through JSON these days. It used to be XML, like So, stuff like that.
Yeah, so Ajax, the X stands for XML, but not very many people send XML over the wire anymore. We usually send JSON. You can send XML, but it's more difficult to consume than JSON is, because JSON was literally meant to be consumed by JavaScript. But JSON is so amazing and so easy and lightweight. It's a smaller footprint than XML, that when you're sending information from server to server now, and let's say the two servers aren't even like JavaScript related, they're not Node servers, they could still be sending information via the JSON format. Like a PHP server could have an API that talks to a .NET server, and maybe they'll exchange JSON information because it's just easier to send and consume than XML.
Okay, so that made it easier for me.
Okay.
So it's evolved, like XML is old, JSON
Yeah.
is the new, slicker, less clunky.
Yeah.
It's the Ferrari.
Like XML
It's nicer.
And
I've never thought that I was driving a Ferrari when I was using JSON. It is what it is. It's a lighter footprint. There's literally a website that compares for beginners. Like, here's what XML looks like, and here's what the equivalent JSON looks like. Yeah, and it's about half the size, roughly. Yeah.
The perk to JSON too, one, there's JSON parsers in every language. But to turn a JSON data representation into an object that you can use in JavaScript, there's almost no overhead to doing that. So it's basically like a free data transform that you get to use.
Whereas it can be a lot more expensive to take data and turn it into XML, or vice versa, especially in PHP, if you try to do that.
Front end or back end? It's front.
JSON is
It's
neither front end or back end, like
just
XML is not front end or back end.
So
It's the message between the front end and the back
fine.
end. Great, good questions, Jeff. You had a question?
I was just going to ask a little slightly different topic. Was it the PHP folks that are here, because this is a WordPress meetup,
Yep.
they're using Composer, or if that's even, I don't even see that Composer gets used with
It does with Laravel a lot.
WordPress, but with Laravel.
Oh yeah, with Laravel, not with WordPress.
I think
Just
some,
like what
some
you're talking about, like if you want to
developers
use ImageMagick or
Composer.
PHP, even if you're doing WordPress, you can use Composer in your project, and it behaves somewhat like NPM, where it will pull in like those PHP libraries, and there's some like friendly wrappers around like ImageMagick and all these other things that you can just like install the Composer for PHP and say like Composer install yada yada ImageMagick thing, and it automatically handles like dynamic loading of those classes in your PHP and all that.
Composer ripped off NPM, and if I remember correctly, NPM ripped off Ruby. Yeah. So there you have it. So those are all good questions. What
So
other?
if you go forward from like some old corporate code with XML, you would replace the XML with JSON.
It could be, yeah, that's a one for
You
one.
would just replace all of the XML clunky stuff
Well,
with a JSON to move
not
it
necessarily.
Said and done.
to
Yeah.
evolve.
There's nothing that XML can do that is in terms of a medium between sharing information that JSON can't do. Yeah,
That's
JSON.
not entirely true.
Okay, all right.
Well, as far as
WSDL?
doing anything with JavaScript, yeah.
What?
I meant like an Ajax type of thing. Yeah.
There's trade-offs, yeah.
Okay.
Well, so Brad was saying that XML can't really do anything special that JSON can't do, and he was arguing that that's not true. And while it is not true, I think it's true for JavaScript. Like, as far as JavaScript is concerned, because XML, you can have like schemas and all this other stuff, but by the time you convert it for JavaScript, you lose all that extra stuff.
Yeah, XML lets you say, we're gonna have a certain set of rules that our XML has to follow, and you can make sure that it follows that set of rules. And there's really nothing like that that I'm aware of for JSON.
There is JSON schema.
There is?
Yeah.
These guys are gonna prove me wrong. Let's talk about some of the talking points now. Let's see. Oh yeah, before we get, there's Node versus io.js. That's definitely a talking point. So real quick, Node, as amazing as it was when it first came out, they were very, very, very slow to progress it. It stayed in the pre-1.0 phase for a long time. And that made people want to fork it off. And yeah, so people forked it, and they basically said, all right, Node, we're done with you. We're gonna take Node, and we're gonna call it io.js.
It was because the developers, or the main contributors for Node, were kind of like in arguments about what they wanted to implement and that kind of stuff. And so I think it was like TJ Holloway-Chuck or somebody that was one of the main people at that time. Wasn't
It was a different TJ.
Oh, it's TJ. Yeah,
Maybe Fontaine? No, sorry, I'm confusing with
one
somebody
of
else.
the TJs decided
A prolific node,
Yeah.
TJ.
decided, like what Brian was saying, to not wait around anymore for them to make up their minds and when they implement it all in these.
Yeah, kind of like what happened with when underscore and Modash. It's kind of like that kind of thing. Or if you've ever used OpenOffice. OpenOffice, apparently they had a bunch of arguments about moving it forward, and it was open source. So some of the developers, from what I understand, left OpenOffice and started LibreOffice. You guys familiar with that story a little bit? No? OpenOffice and LibreOffice are basically the same thing, but LibreOffice is the more progressive version of it. So this is a story that's happened on the web and in software many times with open source.
Happened with Rails too.
Did it happen with Rails?
Like Merv, which was like
That's right.
which was the fork of Rails, and then like eventually the community came back together and emerged back, just like what's happening.
Yeah. So there was a lot of uncertainty for the last 2 years in terms of io.js and Node and which one's going to win whichever one out. They both realized that it wasn't good for the community. They both realized that io.js did some pretty cool things, and so they actually just came back together. And now Node is all of a sudden on 4 when they had a hard time getting to 1. Oh, it's on 5 now. So they are doing some good things with it. So it's good that they came back together with that. So that was kind of a confusing thing for me. But let's talk about JavaScript is everywhere.
Brad, I have one question.
Oh, yeah.
Node. So they got these versions, the versioning in Node, they call it Node 5. What's the actual Semver version?
Well, right now 5.4 point something is the
So
stable
did
branch.
5,
right now.
was 5, did it actually like make breaking changes to 4?
Yes.
Yes. So Node is fully Semver now, meaning that major version changes have broken an API somewhere. So as long as you're if you're on Node 4.1 or whatever, and you want to upgrade to Node 4.2, doing so should be really trivial. You might get extra features, but nothing should break.
Yeah. Cool. So Node is everywhere. Right now, these guys, perhaps, I know some guys in my office, your IDE doesn't have to be like Sublime, right? Written in whatever language Sublime is written in. Like you could write in Atom, which is written in JavaScript. So you can write your JavaScript code on a tool that was written in JavaScript.
Before.
What's that?
Or Adobe brackets before.
Or Adobe brackets before it. So your build tools are written in JavaScript, right? So things like gulp and grunt, like what we're talking about. Your backend code could be Node. And Node, by the way, is not only the application code, but it's also its own server. So whereas you have PHP accompanied with Apache, or you have Nginx, the server accompanied with Ruby or something like that. Node is accompanied with Node. So it's JavaScript application and JavaScript web server. Obviously JavaScript on the front end. You can program JavaScript on hardware now, IoT, so Internet of Things. So basically JavaScript is becoming ubiquitous. It is everywhere. Do you guys have any questions about that, or do you guys have any things you want to talk about with that?
I think the point Brad is trying to make
Is it's
go learn JavaScript because it's everywhere. So
Yeah.
be waiting for it.
One of the main things.
So these things are always changing. So do you think Angular is here to stay, or is it going to be like this history of things that we're not even going to remember?
Angular will not survive forever because no framework
Nothing.
survives forever. And Angular is already being challenged by new ideas. Angular is pretty solid, but it's hard. Languages survive a long time. Frameworks don't really survive a long time.
You've got basically Microsoft and Google backing Angular, and you've got Facebook backing React.
Yeah.
And, for the short term.
Yeah,
So
so
for the
short
next
term.
5 years.
I would say
Yeah, Facebook created React.
Remember-
And Walmart created Happy.js, which is a server-side thing. And despite what your opinions of Walmart, perhaps, Happy.js is pretty awesome.
So Walmart just released this huge open source Rails project for managing ops infrastructure called OneOps.
Yeah, and Happy.js is off of Walmart now. In other words, Walmart still uses it, but they've released it into the community of happy developers. Yeah, they set it free, and now a community manages it, kind of like how a community manages WordPress.
You guys remember what Brad was saying about Backbone?
So it's open source?
Yes, this is all open source.
Sorry.
No, the
So-
Walmart shit.
Yes, the one where happy.js is open source. And it always has been. It's just not.
So, well, because you had that question about Angular, is it going to be around forever? Remember what Brad was saying about Backbone, how nobody like really uses Backbone now when they go and start a new project, but there's probably a lot of companies that are still using it today because they've been using it for the last 5 years or whatever. So Angular is probably the next Backbone. It's big enough, like it has enough momentum to it that it's going to be around for a very long time, probably the next 5 or 6 years at least, as kind of like a legacy thing eventually. Like it's still going strong now, and I think it'll still be going strong for the next year or two easily.
It's going to be around for 10 years. I mean, people are still writing stuff in Flash and Cold Fusion, legacy stuff to this day.
Yeah.
So
There's
it's
a lot
around for a long time.
of really big companies that built a lot of really big projects in Angular, and it's unlikely that those things are going to go away in the short term.
My fun pet thing to do is like anytime I like evaluate like SaaS products all the time. So like websites. It's my pastime is like right clicking on it and inspect. You can just right click inspect element and then you can tell if it's React or Angular like instantaneously. Right. Usually anything new or anything like recent is one of the two.
Yeah.
Microsoft Office 365 recently, I was like they launched a new dashboard and I was like, what's this? I wonder if this is. I right click and it's like NG whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you might want to be in. It's interesting to see what people are doing.
Yes, definitely.
What are you replacing jQuery with?
What am I replacing it with?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm primarily doing, like, currently I'm doing Angular for the company I work for, so you don't use too much jQuery, if at all, depending on, how whoever the architect was decided to go about it. But other than that, I primarily do Node applications, so I don't use jQuery at all in that case. So I haven't really replaced it with anything because in Node applications, there's not really
anything
you don't do DOMs type of stuff directly in Node. So.
But a lot of these monolithic frameworks, they all like Ember and Angular, they have their own ways of working with the DOM, so they don't need Angular. React is specifically, it's not a monolithic framework because it's only the component side of the front end, lacking some of the other parts that you're supposed to kind of fill in yourself. But the thing that React is the view part or the component part, and so it especially doesn't need jQuery. And in fact, React and jQuery are almost like oil and water. They don't really mix very well.
Actually, Angular uses jQuery.
Yes. Yeah, so Angular has their own like jQuery compatible thing that it ships with. You can also shove in just normal jQuery and use that as well, but it abstracts its use of jQuery a bit. React's a completely different way of thinking about how an application runs. It doesn't do DOM manipulation like Angular, Ember, or Backbone, or basically everything before it.
But consider that, are you good with command line? Okay. Angular is probably easier to get going, especially for someone who's not good at command line, because you can literally just do a little bit of HTML. And you know how you like bring in jQuery on CDN? You can bring in Angular on CDN, and you're off to the races with Angular. You just got to somehow get Angular into the browser. And then the way Angular works is you basically decorate the HTML with special attributes that don't really exist in HTML, but Angular makes them come to life. And so you can actually be successful using Angular without really knowing very much JavaScript at all. And so if that's your goal, then Angular is definitely a good choice. People who graduate from tech boot camps, though, like let's say they don't know any development at all, and they go to an Angular boot camp, and that's all they know is Angular. They come out of the boot camp, and employers complain that they don't really know JavaScript very well. They know Angular, but they don't know JavaScript very well. As opposed to when we did research, when people went to a Backbone-oriented, and I know Backbone's not the popular thing right now, but Backbone makes you get your hands dirty with JavaScript. Even though Backbone's not popular in the industry, when people go to a Backbone-based boot camp, they come out and maybe they're going to work in a company that doesn't do Backbone, but they know how JavaScript works. And React kind of falls into that same category where we find it fun because we've been around the block with JavaScript a little bit, and so React is new and different and it's shiny. but you have to, the way you get React to be powerful is to use JSX. That's this tool that goes with it. The way you get JSX to work is to get Babel running with Webpack and ES6 and all these things. And all the examples you're going to see are ES6, so you got to get Babel running. So there's a bigger setup environment that you probably need to get going to work with React. Not that it's required, but it kind of is if you're going to look at any docs and make sense of it. So Angular, totally easy to get going, but not JavaScript heavy, at least at first. React, a bigger setup, but I think it's a lot funner once we get going. That's my take on it.
So I have a follow-up question.
Okay.
Since you guys said you have a lot of experience with JavaScript, so back in time, I used to have some exposure of JavaScript when I was writing ActionScript on server-side JavaScript. If you may remember, Netscape Enterprise Server, long time ago.
Yeah.
So the challenge at that time I was facing, the lack of tools or how you can really debug and actually, come up with a more holistic solution, right? So have you guys seen? I'm pretty sure that
Netscape Enterprise Server?
Sorry?
Netscape Enterprise Server, you use function that?
Yes.
I worked on that back in the 90s.
Yeah, well,
So it's like server-side JavaScript back then. You just put a server tag in your page and you write some JavaScript in there.
yeah, so I used that in 1999.
Wow.
That just shows how old I am.
That's very cool.
So then,
So was your question in regard? Sorry, you were asking if the debugging tools around JavaScript have gotten better?
Yes, that was my question.
Considerably, yeah. So now, like doing breakpoints and stuff in JavaScript's much easier than it was. 5 years ago that was nearly impossible. Now it's trivial. Yeah, the tooling's come a long way, both in the client and on the server, particularly in Chrome, but Firefox has come a long way. I mean, Firebug was basically what launched like the front-end debugging tool chain. It's really good. Even like the new IE stuff is coming with a pretty decent debugging tools now. Yeah, it's especially if you haven't touched it since the ActionScript days, it's so much better.
So when you launch your Node server, whatever it might be, you're going to do that from the command line, right? And you got to keep that terminal window open while Node's going. So what happens is any node that you write, if you want to do like old school like console log this, console log that, just to see what a variable is, those are going to show up in the actual command line console. And then if you have any code that you're writing that's front end, and you say console.log, that's going to show up in the DevTools, like Chrome DevTools console. But also Chrome DevTools also has like breakpoint type stuff and a whole bunch of debugging stuff that's super high class right now. And
there are ways to tie Node, the server-side process, into Chrome's debugger on the front end. So you can do breakpointing, you can do like walking through actual like line-by-line debugging using Chrome's debug tools on your Node code, which has existed forever and was really tricky to set up, and now that's super easy to do too.
Thank you.
I have another question.
What's that? You have another question? Of course. So what is it?
Well, you were mentioning that React is a whole other animal with the way you start it and implement it. So how is it completely different than the old school way?
So historically, like if you look at how you used to build applications in jQuery, a lot of it is driven by DOM manipulation. So you select an element, you say, all right, I want to like inject some new content into this element or whatever, or maybe I will store application state in part of the DOM or something. Like there's all sorts of like really disgusting things you can do with it as well. But that sort of shaped how web development occurred and still occurs today. Like you think of it in terms of DOM and manipulating the DOM. With React, it's a little bit different. You're not really dealing with the DOM. You're dealing with these components, and what the components do as the state of your application changes is driven entirely by that state, by the data that you're passing into the component. So you're not saying like, well, go pick this element and like inject a new element into it. You're saying, take this component, put it here, and if this component gets this data, this is what it'll render. If it gets this data, it'll render this instead.
So you have to write a lot of and-if statements.
No, it's all it's basically like
they make it feel like writing HTML. That's what JSX is. JSX feels like you're writing HTML, but it's inside of the JavaScript file. Okay. Yeah. But JSX, even though it looks and feels like HTML, it goes through a transpiler process that turns it into regular, ordinary JavaScript. So when you do in jQuery, when you say go and select this thing and add a class to it, or jQuery, make a new div tag and put it onto the page, ultimately under the hood, jQuery is ultimately doing a document.create element div tag and doing like low-level JavaScript stuff that has always been a pain to do. That's why jQuery exists, to make that easier. Now, in React, and specifically JSX inside of React, you just write what looks like a div tag. And if I showed you JSX right now, you'd be like, that's a div tag, that's HTML. And I would say, well, it's not really. It looks just like HTML, but it's going to go through a process of being turned into, eventually, the document.createElement div tag thing. Okay, so JSX is to JavaScript what Sass is to CSS. Okay, in Sass or less, you get to write in this magical language that doesn't really exist, that that it has all these things that don't really exist, and it's all going to eventually get turned into something that is real, which is CSS, right? That's what JSX is. It's like this Facebook way of saying, we just want to make up a language that doesn't really exist in any other standard, but it's going to get turned into real JavaScript. Does that make sense? That's what makes it a slightly different animal.
It's like a film layer.
Yeah.
It's like a filter on your camera.
Yeah, just like a syntactic sugar. So you know that you're dealing with HTML, but you're really not. React, everything is JavaScript.
And then you can take it off too, but then all the stuff that you want to.
Well, because it has this interesting way of working with the DOM that is really special, it doesn't play nice with other stuff wanting to work in the DOM at the same time. They will interfere with each other.
Yeah.
Crash.
So I mean, React's basically like constantly keeping the state of its components up to date. So if you were to take an external piece of script, say I take a jQuery thing and I say, all right, well, manipulate this component after it's been rendered. React will immediately switch it back to what it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
So it's dominant.
React is a control freak.
It's dominant.
Yeah. So.
But can you remove it and then do?
Well, by removing it, that's like saying I want to get rid of React altogether, and you're going
backwards again.
Well, it's not that you're going backwards, but you could say I don't want to go React anymore. I want to go with Angular, but almost time.
No.
But does React have all the capabilities everything else does?
Yep.
Okay, so that
it works a little bit different, but it's awesome. React's awesome. You should all play with React. It's really cool.
And I just did a video last week for Phoenix JavaScript on beginner React. So you can always find that. I can make sure that Dallin gets that to post up. It's a YouTube video. It's beginner React. But keep in mind that it is not a monolithic framework, right? Like it's not like what Angular is, where it provides you everything, the whole kitchen sink. What did you say? Yeah, everything in the kitchen sink, right? React is just a small piece of the pie, so you need to mix React with something that manages your information, your data that goes through React. And so we use what's called Flux or Redux for that kind of thing. You're going to need a router. And so there's a thing called React Router, which is optional. It's like this optional thing that can be accompanied with React. So you really have to piece all these things together. You need to be a little bit more experienced with JavaScript, I think, to take on React for that reason. Then Angular is just everything is there.
Yeah, it's like, think of it like baking a cake. With React, you're going to go and buy all the ingredients. You're going to pick and choose which ingredients you want.
It's like a kit that comes with all the ingredients.
Angular is like you go and buy the entire store. Instead of
React is like saying, okay, you need to go buy these things at the store, but you can go in and get any eggs you want, you can get any kind of milk you want, you can get any kind of flour you want, but you're going to eventually need all these parts in order to make this thing. Whereas Angular is more of like the box that you just pour into the thing, add water, and go like this, and it's all put together. Does that make sense?
Yes, and you don't even know what's in it. You just know.
Yeah. So.
There's a saying in just the development community at large, not necessarily web development, but it goes, I forget how the beginning of it goes, but basically what it boils down to is what you wanted was a banana, but you ended up getting a gorilla holding the banana and the entire jungle. So it's like an analogy for, like usually when people use that analogy, they're talking about write programs simpler, don't carry around state with like your functions and that kind of stuff. So that's kind of like what Angular is. It's like the monkey holding the banana and the entire jungle, whereas React is just the banana.
It's like artists saying, just keep it simple, stupid.
Right.
When PHP was conceived, They literally wanted it to be the easiest hello world on the internet. And it almost still is to this day. It takes just an angle bracket, a question mark, and then you can just say echo hello world, and that's how easy PHP is. Okay, you tell the beginner that, and then you're like, all right, now here's Laravel, go to work, or here's WordPress. Is it really that easy? No, by the time you get a huge ecosystem like WordPress going, I mean, you don't even have to go into the ecosystem of WordPress and know it to be successful with WordPress, right? Like you can just use it from the administrative standpoint. But it's the same thing in JavaScript. You know, JavaScript has a really easy hello world. It's just console log hello world. Okay, go off and learn React. It's not quite that easy. You still need to know a lot of the ins and outs, and there's a lot of moving parts. Dan, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm curious. You don't have to comment specifically on WordPress, although if you can, great. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on WordPress, Drupal. You know, the CMS world. How does this transition into a web that's more driven by JavaScript?
Okay, we'll all give our takes on it. You guys want to go, and then I'll go, or vice versa?
Not it.
Okay. The reason why this is a challenging thing to talk about is because WordPress and Drupal have not positioned themselves in the way that they like to do their ecosystem in a way that works really well with what JavaScript is doing. Okay, so it's not that they're incompatible, but the reason why a lot of WordPress stuff is also using jQuery on the front end is because jQuery is really easy to work with anything. But all the ecosystem stuff that we're talking about, you really have to have a certain environment set up. It's a Node environment. It's a full JavaScript stack environment, and WordPress has decided to. WordPress's success is also what its failures are, in the sense that it isolates itself and insulates itself from everything around it. It's got its own little ecosystem of plugins and everything, and that makes someone really successful at WordPress really fast. But it's not like WordPress blends with anything else. Trying to blend WordPress with all the stuff that we're talking about is about as easy as trying to blend WordPress with Laravel, right? Like those two systems even those are both PHP and they'll still butt heads. You can't do them both at the same time. It just doesn't make any sense. So it's hard to know what WordPress is going to do with JavaScript in the future. You guys probably know more than we do, but we've been hearing news lately that your guys' administrative panel is going to be written in Node, right? So that's interesting. Do you guys want to talk about that, and we'll give you what our thoughts are on that? But we need some direction from you on that conversation.
I was going to ask you to follow up on that. So it was the WordPress.com has already switched over to JavaScript based, which is the Calypso and the REST API. Have you guys followed that or have experience with that at all?
REST API?
Well,
Calypso specifically.
Oh, okay.
I think you're asking. I haven't. I knew it was a thing. I've heard about it. Like that, it made a lot of news in like the Node community. Like, hey, like this classic PHP thing is now running in Node, and that's really interesting. I'm curious to see how that's going to play out long term. I think like WordPress and Drupal and a lot of the other PHP applications, where their strength came from was that PHP was everywhere. If I want to get a site online, I can do so for free, or near free on a nearly infinite number of hosting solutions, simply because it's written in PHP. That same is not true for Node. There's a lot of options for getting Node applications online, but it's definitely a different ecosystem. So I don't know how that's going to play out. I don't think that they can necessarily walk away from PHP and still get the install base that they're used to.
This is currently on the .com side, so that's where like you just go in and actually set up a site. So you don't even set up your own.
Sure, but it's still extending to like the WordPress.org though, right? The part that you install.
Yeah.
But my understanding was that if they want to, or
it connects to Jetpack, but it's, it can't yet because it uses the proprietary WordPress API. It doesn't use the open source REST API yet.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, it is really cool, and it's neat to know that the team is kind of trying to branch out and try new things. And I think getting WordPress administration behind any REST API or any sort of like standard sort of API is going to do great things for them in the long run. But I don't know what to expect of them like writing their admin panel in Node. I mean, they had a reason to do it. I'm sure the reason for them was internal, but they are probably trying to extend whatever benefit they got out of it to the community as well. but I don't know. It's just not a world that I'm really into.
Yeah, and that's also, I was at the WordCamp Summit at WordCamp US, and they were talking about that. And two worlds, they can't really bring them together because it's on this other API, and like WordPress.org, of course, Shopify isn't doing that for a while. Just how to use plugins, really with that kind of UI. Yeah. That's kind of what they were talking about. And it could take 6 months to 18 months to actually migrate Calypso over to the WordPress.org directly and stuff like that. Because the guys using now is their proprietary to that.
I feel like the WordPress plugin ecosystem is the single biggest reason for WordPress's success. Wouldn't you agree?
It's massive.
I feel like the WordPress plugin system is the single thing that's holding WordPress back the most
Plugins and themes, right?
from okay, because if WordPress, if PHP is becoming unpopular, is that a statement you guys are familiar with? Okay, PHP is becoming unpopular.
Well, now you know.
Okay. I personally think the only thing that's keeping PHP afloat, honestly, is WordPress.
But why is it? Because it's a community.
Because PHP is not respected amongst a lot of developers for some of its flaws. JavaScript is also not respected by some developers for its flaws, but for some reason JavaScript is more forgiven, I guess, for them. But without going into PHP bashing, listen, I've made a career off of doing PHP. I bought my house from writing PHP projects. Okay, I bought my car. Everything I own, I bought with income. Yeah, it's this thing I did in college, and I only did it once. No, but PHP, I'm not a PHP basher, but I see the writing on the wall, and that is that PHP is becoming unpopular. So if WordPress were to want to switch to Node, unlike most applications that are out there where switching to a whole new language is painful but doable, how would WordPress even approach that when all their success is their plugin system? How would they turn their huge ecosystem into JavaScript? PHP is going to be inside of WordPress for a very, very long time, and it might get to the point where the only things written in PHP are WordPress, and that makes the community more fragile. Unfortunately, I know that people still do stuff in Laravel. I know plenty of PHP shops that still do stuff in PHP, but I've been in this industry for 15 years, and PHP used to be a lot of people, and Ruby came along and it started going like this, and then Node came along and it started going like this, and now there are more people doing non-PHP work than there are doing PHP work, and that wasn't the case 10 years ago.
But then if I wanted to build my own site without the WordPress and still have the response, the CMS.
For most people building websites today, like WordPress is still the answer.
Unfortunately,
it's the gateway drug.
Well, it is. It's the easiest thing out there to build a small static website, or not static website, but small informational website for small businesses. And there aren't a lot of other options out there. I mean, honestly, there are almost no other options besides WordPress for making a small business website, and that is the single most powerful thing that your community has going for itself.
I can't name a single Node CMS.
Yeah, I can't name a single Node CMS either.
Well, why aren't you guys making it?
So there are other CMSs out there, like let's say Jekyll, right? But Jekyll is for developers. Like you got to know command line to run Jekyll, so you can never give a customer a Jekyll project and expect them to do anything with it. So the only CMS out there that's a true CMS that allows like a non-programmer to get into an administrative dashboard and bang on keys and do stuff is I kind of consider it like layers. Like the first layer of web development, like the cheapest layer is like Wix and Squarespace. Those are that's like on the level of like Facebook. Like anyone can do that. My brother has a Wix website and he put it together in like 5 minutes, right? The next level of development is the CMSs of the world. And the next level of development is custom applications.
Right.
Custom applications cost anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000 right now. Why? Because it takes me hundreds and hundreds of hours and a big team to do it.
But why doesn't Elastic, right? Isn't that
our company?
Yes.
Yeah.
Why don't they see this? Like where I'm coming from.
This is in our business domain.
Yeah, this is what we do. We don't build CMSs. We build tools.
I know, but
That's way outside of our.
Let's do it, guys.
Yeah.
Well, I want to make sure, this is kind of a little bit of a going off topic, so I want to make sure we answer more. We can have a conversation after this, but I want to make sure we're talking about the right things. I want to talk about, if you guys want to talk about it, I don't know, this is kind of a hot topic thing in JavaScript. I don't even know if you guys want to say, no, we're not going to talk about that. Is JavaScript object-oriented?
No, it's not.
Okay, so that's an interesting discussion piece, and I'll let you guys say your piece on it. A lot of people say yes, a lot of people say no. Here's what I'm going to say. Everything in JavaScript is an object, pretty much. Okay, strings are objects in JavaScript. Arrays are objects. Okay, strings have methods on them.
Let me just explain how that works, just so nobody's confused. So you have the primitives, right? Strings, numbers, booleans, null, and undefined. These are immutable things. If you write a string in JavaScript, you can't change that string. So in a variable, if you want to replace a string in a variable, you're actually replacing it with a whole new string. But what JavaScript does for you is all of those immutable things get wrapped with special functions, and then that special function, it's like a little factory, spits out an object that contains your original string and then adds a bunch of methods to it. So that's what Brad is referring to.
Yeah. Okay. So everything in JavaScript is an object. No, objects are everywhere in JavaScript, and they almost always have been. PHP, even though it is a lot closer to being an object-oriented language than obviously JavaScript is, because it uses classical, or what's called class-based object orientation, where you make classes and then define objects from those. JavaScript has what's called prototypical inheritance instead of class-based inheritance. And so there are objects in JavaScript. There are objects everywhere in JavaScript, more so than PHP, I think. But people say that JavaScript is not an object-oriented language. And it's just an interesting conversation. This is like one of the biggest arguing points that we have in JavaScript. Right?
Shouldn't we take a step back and?
No.
Go ahead.
It's like it is.
I mean, it is what it is. Man.
Yeah. Well, that's how we feel, but they've never had.
We got a question.
Yeah.
I think that if we take a step back and actually, the reason why people think JavaScript is not object-oriented, since it does not qualify, some of these key attributes of object orientation, such as polymorphism or abstraction or encapsulation.
Okay, so
you want to repeat his question?
So I was asking how those concepts actually work for JavaScript.
So he's saying that a lot of people say that JavaScript is not object-oriented because it doesn't have things like polymorphism and abstractions and stuff, right? And so how do those things work in JavaScript? Well, I would argue that JavaScript does have polymorphism. Maybe not in the sense of like a classical object-oriented language where that kind of thing is like built into the core language, but you can still achieve that. So like with JavaScript, like Brad said, there's objects are literally everywhere, but JavaScript is not object-oriented, as in it doesn't have that class-based system. So now we have ES6 now has the class keyword, but all that is just sugar for the prototypal underpinnings of the language. So you can achieve all of those different things like polymorphism and abstractions just with the prototypal way that JavaScript works. A lot of people I've seen argue, like a lot of people that are really kind of high up in the JavaScript community argue that prototypal is actually more powerful than classical inheritance.
I've heard that too. And I think you got to get it's like learning to walk a different way. In JavaScript, just because JavaScript doesn't have classes and all the things that Java has, Java is a respected language for all the things that Java has, right? It's a solid language. Java, C++, like those are the languages that have built, almost everything that we use, like in OSs and everything, right? But JavaScript is a functional programming language at its core, and that comes from Brendan Eich wanting to write something based on scheme and self. Okay, and so JavaScript has first-class functions, function, and we'll all talk about what that means. These guys should probably describe what that means better than I can. But in other languages, JavaScript or functions are second-class citizens to objects. Like objects are the first-class citizens, and functions are just these things that just facilitate objects. In JavaScript, functions can do way more things than all these other languages functions can do, if that makes sense. You could pass functions into functions, which is maybe like, you're like, oh, we do that in PHP. Yeah, only recently. We've been doing that in JavaScript for over a decade. Functions can be assigned to variables, and then as a variable, it can be passed around anywhere. Functions can be used to create basically constructors to make objects. That doesn't happen in PHP for sure.
In Java.
What's that?
It happens in Java.
Yeah. What are some of the things that make JavaScript's functions first-class citizens, as they say?
Well, I mean, you already named most of them, but I mean, they can be anonymous functions. I don't know. In Java, can you have an anonymous function?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. And PHP can now, but that's kind of a newer thing in
Yeah,
PHP.
that's pretty good.
And you know how PHP, by the way, is always, I mean, to be honest, it's always playing catch up. You know how in PHP now you can make an array with just square brackets? Where do you think they got that from? Been doing that in JavaScript for like 15 years. Yeah. So that's called an array literal, where you just literally go to making an array, and kind of we have object literals in JavaScript where you literally make an object. So you know, things like callback functions in PHP, those are all inspired by the languages and stuff. So anyways, functions are the powerful thing. So if someone is used to a language where functions are a little bit inferior, and they go to JavaScript and all I see is functions, they might think, oh, inferior language, no object, none of these, but you don't realize maybe yet just how powerful the functions are. Yeah, that was your feeling? Yeah, so start learning some of the functional paradigms, and you'll see power that you'll be like, wow, that is a weird pattern. You know what JavaScript doesn't have? It doesn't have any of the traditional patterns that all the, a singleton in Java is the same singleton as PHP, right? All the class-based languages all have the big four, so to speak, right? Yeah, that's because all those languages are based on a certain way of writing code. I kind of think of all those languages as being like French, German, or French, Italian, Spanish, like they all come from Latin, right? Just like those languages that we're talking about all come from C++, right? Or C, right? So JavaScript is like Japanese. It is based on a whole different set of rules that will make no sense to someone who's only ever known Latin-based languages. But it's still a powerful language. Yeah.
I would do one more question.
Okay.
Just want to make sure you had some time to talk about ES6.
Sure, go ahead.
I did want to talk about that actually. So, I mean, everybody's heard by now, I hope, that last year they finalized ES6, which is officially called ES2015. So they're moving away from the numbered system and going by year. So their plan is every year they're going to do a new release. So this year we'll have ES2016. So basically, it was kind of the same story as like the ES4 to ES5 thing, where ES4 they were kind of like arguing over stuff, and then eventually they're like, okay, let's just get ES5 out there. Well, that's kind of what happened with ES6. Is like ES5 sat, for a long time without getting any updates, and then finally they were like, okay, everyone, the whole community is like clamoring for all these different changes. Let's just get it done. So they released ES6. It's final now, and it has like a whole, there's a huge array of all these different changes and new things to the language. But going forward, like ES2016 and ES2017, there'll be much smaller, easier to digest additions to the language going forward. So we have a lot of things now, like we mentioned a few times already, the class sugar, we have arrow functions.
Explain what that means, class sugar.
So, the class keyword has been there since at least ES5, maybe even before that. But you couldn't actually use it. It didn't do anything. It would just, JavaScript would complain if you wrote the word class as a variable name or something like that. But now it actually works. So you can say class, blah, and define the methods and properties of that class. And you can extend from one class to create another and so on. So they work.
As a constructor, yeah.
Right. So they work, and there's a super as well. They work a lot like classes in a language like Java, but there's a lot of things that are missing from it. And those things are planned for future releases. Like ES 2016, 2017, they'll have more and more stuff coming into the class.
To that, I just want to add that when JavaScript was conceived, by the way, just so you know, the reason why JavaScript has some weird things with it, JavaScript was written in 10 days. When Brendan Eich wrote JavaScript, he was writing it as a prototype to show his boss that he could write it. And then his boss said, okay, now Internet Explorer is coming out with all these things. We need to push this out to market. And they're like, whoa, this thing is like not polished. There's all these things that don't make sense in JavaScript, and it's because of all this history stuff. But when he was writing it, he reserved all the keywords in Java inside of JavaScript, even though they weren't used. So the word like class and extends have been reserved in JavaScript for 15 years, and we're only just now getting around to making it real. But it's just so you know, it's syntax sugar. So ultimately, under the hood, JavaScript is still based on prototypical inheritance. So you might write things. It's almost like it was made to satisfy the Java developers. Like, okay, we finally gave you what you wanted, classes and JavaScript. Wink, wink. It's really just like a facade to get to prototypical inheritance in a way that maybe feels more familiar to you.
So,
right.
So do you guys, I don't know if you know this, but how do you compare JavaScript with Groovy? Have you heard of
Groovy?
Groovy is more like a scripting language, but it's, I have never.
Let's save that question. Let's save that question because I know we're wrapping up and there was only supposed to be one more question. But let's just really quick finish the ES6 thing because we kind of went off into a different direction. And then I think we have to call it quits, and we can still mingle around. Okay.
So I'm not gonna name every new feature. I mean, you want to know every new feature, go and look it up. But the big ones are arrow functions, which anybody that's programmed in other languages that support them will know what that's about. But basically, it's just a much shorter way of writing functions, and you get a couple of like bonuses, like context and things. And then also we have the const keyword. You can actually make real constant variables now. You have let.
Not real constants, but
well, it's real enough. They don't change.
They do. Like name function parameters. The instance doesn't change.
Like objects?
Yeah.
Well, because objects are references.
Right. Did you list
let's let these guys
just named arguments, functions, and default argument values for functions?
Named arguments?
Oh,
yeah, you're talking about.
You're talking about type hinting? No, you're talking about defaults for arguments. Yeah, we finally got defaults for arguments. PHP's had that forever. Hey, we copied something.
Well,
every other language. Yeah, pretty much.
Default parameters.
Ruby still funky with that stuff.
Cool. Those are probably like the biggest ones, but there's lots.
The love for destructuring and spreading.
Oh,
and
I love destructuring, but those are not even like destructuring arrays and stuff, but they're not like spreads are half there. So
all these things that
7 to get all of it.
All these things that they're talking about. Remember when HTML5 and CSS3 came out, and you could read about it, but you couldn't use it because it wasn't supported in the browser? It's exactly what's going on in JavaScript right now. Okay, a lot of these features are not yet supported in the browser. So remember what Modernizer was to bring these things to the browser to kind of to polyfill the browser for these things. That's what Babel is, if you're unfamiliar. Okay, so you have let's say Webpack, which is like your general build tool, can help you bring common JS concepts to the front end, but it can also be your Babel loader. So that you can right now write the ES6 syntax for the front end, even though the front end doesn't understand ES6 syntax. It kind of like rewrites it.
Okay. Yeah, so while the specification is final, you know, ES 2015 is real, not all the browsers have finished implementing all of it yet. So they're still, you know, working on adding those features in.
But Node has implemented a lot of them because server-side languages are always easier to roll out new features in than anything the browsers are going to wage war over, right? So it's a lot of these things are already in Node, they're just not in the browser. All right, we're going to wrap it up with that. Who likes JavaScript? Come on. All right, there you go.
Yes, I think I speak for all of us. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you guys so much for taking
Thanks.
Okay, so as we